Everyone, that's our. The 2024 year of national elections along three sort of dimension which I always said here, very well, it's the other.
Yeah, yeah. I just need to be here to look at the slides, so that's why I turned it a bit. So, and then I'm going to move it this way when because I need to see if the slides advance and all that, right? So I need to. No,
We also have the option, we can have the camera just.
yeah, I still want to put six. Yeah, what audience here is oh, wait. Should we sit close? Maybe they'll get ahead. Okay. Whoops. I'm good. Is it started? Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Godin. I'm with PTAC, Petroleum Technology Alliance Canada, and I'm delighted to be here at COP29, the conference about greenhouse gas emissions, to address one of the high importance topic in this journey to reduce emissions, which is reducing emissions of methane. Methane is a greenhouse gas that is at least 28 times more potent than CO2 and represent one of the priorities for all the programming to reduce greenhouse gas globally. I have a few words of introductions, and I'm joined by a distinguished group of panelists. Matt Johnson, professor at Carleton University. Timothy Egan, president of the Canadian Gas Association. Patrick McDonald, assistant deputy minister, air, climate, and clean technology with the Alberta Environment and Protected Areas. And finally, Yvan Champagne, chief carbon officer, Carbon AI. And least and not least, Alan Fogwell, who will join us through a pre-recorded video message. But first, I will be introducing the topic and then inviting my panelists to join me on the stage. So as we think about the whole global topic of greenhouse gas emission, we first need to look at energy demand. And this simple graphics here indicates that through the next decade, we will see increased demand for energy from various sectors, and particularly electricity. Next slide. And in the if we look at the details of what sources of fuel will supply to that demand, we see that renewables is the area of greatest growth, followed by natural gas, and in particular, coal is declining and oil is flat. Next slide. But what about carbon emissions? So the change, despite the growth in demand of energy, the change in the fuel mix means that there will be a reduction in we're predicting a reduction in CO2 emissions with various trajectories depending on various assumptions that the forecasters make. And that's about 5 gigatons of CO2 reduction. However, to get to the 1.5 degrees to avoid disastrous climate impact, another 10 gigatons need to be achieved. So that's the size of the challenge. Next slide. Now we want to dive into methane as a specific component of the greenhouse gas emissions. This shows the various producers of energy, oil and natural gas, and their commitment to various frameworks, international, global frameworks to reduce methane emissions. So there is traction, there is commitment, there is programming in place. And if we look at by country on the next slide, we will show that, again, various countries have made their pledges to reduce emissions of methane. You see Canada central in having made commitments are all under the three programs here. And on the next slide, when we talk about methane, we first need to detect and measure them. And this graphic shows the various methods at a high level, from very close handheld devices like cameras or handheld detectors, all the way to satellites on your far right. And the 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 satellites, of course, detecting from space, detect on a larger area, not as great resolution, and again, their resolution in terms of kilograms per hour or rate measurements is less or greater than the handhelds. Next slide. And these are Canadian greenhouse gas reduction, but for methane, the methane fuel specifically, in Canada, in Alberta, in other provinces, we have made great reductions in methane emissions. The Alberta government did report earlier, a couple of weeks ago, that Alberta methane emissions from industry have been reduced by 52% from their baseline. And other provincial governments as well have seen reductions, and we'll hear about that today from measurements in British Columbia and Saskatchewan. So the past has been very encouraging, that we have made some great reductions, but more needs to be done, and that's that continuing that decline there in the next decade to see even greater reductions. Next slide. And some of the attributable here, why do we see these reductions? It's a component of technology development, and we'll hear from that side. New technologies have been developed from innovators, from university research, programming, while production has remained constant. So this slide shows on the green line, production being constant in this is Alberta data. In Alberta, while the methane intensity has declined, and various text box indicate the several technology development programs that have been implemented through the decade. Next slide. And this is just an illustration of the vibrant technology development ecosystem, all the way from university research to government labs to innovators that 5 years ago were 2 people. Today, there are 50 people having developed technologies and exporting them to the world. Next slide. And the range of technologies for methane include all these aspects. I won't read them here, but to the operation of industry, whether it's pump, instruments, or detection devices. And final slide. So we have a number of directories here. We invite you to look at the QR code. They list Canadian innovators, vendors, providers of technologies for methane, for carbon capture, for other environmental attributes. Thank you for listening to my introductory remarks. And then I would like to pass the opportunity here at the podium to Matt Johnson, Professor and Scientific Director at Carleton University. Matt?
All right, good morning. Thank you, Mark, for that excellent introduction and great overview. I'd like to share a little bit about the work that we're doing at Carleton University in collaboration with numerous government, federal government, provincial government, and international partners and companies to quantify and reduce methane emissions. And this includes aspects of developing new technologies, trialing new technologies, but most importantly, putting them into practice. So we can go to the next slide. So just for context, for those who don't know, if you look globally at methane emissions, maybe the energy sector is, somewhere, call it around a third. But if we look at Canada specifically, it's a bit of a different picture than most. It's a little bit over half of total methane emissions, anthropogenic methane emissions, are from the energy sector. And so this is why in Canada, we're so focused on methane reduction in this sector. We're proud of the successes we have. We acknowledge there's quite a bit of work to be done. But if Canada is going to meet its climate commitments, this is going to be paramount. And so in the work that we're doing in this lab, in my energy emissions research lab, we've been trialing airborne technologies. Picture there is shown from Bridger Photonics. But in particular, we was spending time in the field doing controlled release work, building up probability detection curves, quantification models that allow us to deploy this new technology. With that, we can start flying over sites and getting images like you see in the upper right of the screen, where we can detect individual sources. This wasn't possible 6 years ago. It has just fundamentally changed the way we approach methane emissions. To that, then we spent a lot of time in the field working with companies, working with governments to follow up these sources, investigate what's driving emissions to better inform our mitigation strategies. That has included then detailed measurements of combustion sources like compressors and catalytic converters. And I just want to highlight in the bottom of the screen just one particular technology that was developed in partnership with CRIN and others as a technology for measuring storage tank emissions. Maybe not the thing you thought you'd talk about when you first woke up this morning, but this is a really important source in the energy sector. And this is innovative kind of Canadian technology that's now being deployed at different locations around the world, as we'll talk about. But probably the most important aspect of this is what the technologies can achieve when we harness them. And so what we really focus on in our lab is the analytics to put all this together. And so that's not a graphic I expect anybody to read or see. It's been published elsewhere, but what it's really trying to illustrate is if you take all of these well-characterized technologies and use them, harness their power together, we can actually do quite amazing things. And we've fundamentally, I think, changed our understanding of methane emissions in the sector. So to switch over to some examples, there's a map of Western Canada. Canada is a large producer of oil and gas resources, maybe 190,000 active wells, 30-ish thousand facilities. And using the kind of technologies I highlighted in the previous slide, we've been doing large scale surveys for the past couple of years to better understand our emissions and drive mitigation. And so skipping a ton of details, let me just show you a couple pretty pictures and pie charts. What this is kind of unprecedented insight into the sources that actually drive our emissions. If I could take the time and show you what used to be in the federal inventories, they would be very different pie charts. The fact that we can produce this has changed how provinces approach their emissions reductions, how industry approaches it. And as we will show in a second, it's actually starting to have measurable success. And this is really exciting that we're not just talking about, desktop exercise and calculating emissions. We're talking about real measured, verified emissions and trying to get verifiable reductions. And so let me show you a couple trends on that. So here's the province of Saskatchewan in Canada. And so what's important here is the bar that you're seeing is actually measured now. So this is verified what emission levels were in 2020. And then if I advance that 2020 and 2023, we've now been able to do surveys year over year. And for the first time that I'm aware of, we're measuring this year over year decline. That's about 22% over the 4 years, maybe 5% a year. That's quite significant. Now, to be fair, if I flip that over intensities and show you where the target line is, there's still a lot of work to do, no question. And in the context of this meeting, I think we need to acknowledge that. But that doesn't take away from the fact that there's clear year over year progression in a measured way. And that's really important if we're going to solve this together. Let me switch over to BC. I think the news is even better there. So similar story, we were able to do a baseline of emissions in 2021. And then we've just wrapped this up a couple of weeks ago, an inventory for 2023 in BC. That's a shorter time frame and an even larger reduction, pushing 45% just in that intervening time, notwithstanding the uncertainties in these measurements, to be clear. But the really compelling case is if I switch that over to intensities, look at how the intensities are falling and put that kind of international target. Sorry, I should have explained. For those who don't know, this isn't kind of the international target through OGMP 2.0 that Mark had on his slides, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. It's echoed in UNEP by MEO and in the US Inflation Reduction Act. It's kind of a emerging alignment around this target of 0.2% methane intensity where we need to be by the end of the decade. And to my knowledge, BC is perhaps the first jurisdiction in the world where independently measured and verified, they're there as of this year. And that's really exciting. We need everybody there. We need to do this all across Canada. But we have to acknowledge progress where it happens. And I think that's very exciting for Canadians. So a key part of this is Canada's leadership in methane overall. And so I want to say that this is featured in open source peer-reviewed publications. It's a big part of what we do in our lab. There's comprehensive data sharing. We've created kind of a Dataverse site that shares all the detailed analytics, all the sites for this. And maybe most importantly, and one of the proudest accomplishments of my team, our federal and provincial partners, the PTAC, UNEP who support us, is Canada, as of last year, is now taking the data that I shared, and that directly informs the official inventories going forward. So Canada is one of the first, if not the first country in the world to directly incorporate measurements into official inventories. And that's really helping steer reductions and achieve success. And so finally, just in the theme of this panel, the end to the world aspect, I'm proud to share that we're collaborating with United Nations International Methane Emissions Observatory, UNEP by MEO. And these techniques that we've pioneered in Canada are being deployed in Colombia as the first jurisdiction in the global south to try to develop a measurement-informed inventory there. We did flights earlier this year. We are sending ground teams that I'm looking forward to in February coming up, hopefully. And so stay tuned for that. And so with that, I'd like to thank PTAC and Corinne for the opportunity to speak and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Matt. Please join us, and Tim and Patrick, join us on the panel. Oh, and Yvonne as well. So while you're getting set up, I'd like to provide the opportunity to Timothy Egan, President of the Canadian Gas Association, to offer your opening remarks, Tim.
Thank you, Mark, and thanks, Matt, for that presentation. Both your presentations lay out a perfect picture of the situation. I'm going to give a slightly different perspective. I'm going to speak from the perspective of the gas industry. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yep.
So just some facts about the industry. So Canada's the 5th largest producer of natural gas in the world. We're also a top 10 consumer of gas. And natural gas is almost 40% of the energy end use that we use in Canada. And that's actually growing. Our consumption of gas is growing. And it's growing because people want to use it. They're using it in their homes and businesses. So we're one of the highest demand energy end sources in the country. Now, natural gas is overwhelmingly methane. So methane is, in fact, the fuel we use. So when we talk about trying to reduce methane emissions, what we're really talking about is how we better manage the fuel we use. And we want to manage it well because we don't want to waste it. In fact, we want to get better at managing it all the time because it's in our interest to do so. Now, Canada's methane emissions represent roughly 1% of global emissions. That's rough numbers. And while global emissions overall have actually been rising over the last couple of decades, as both Mark and Matt noted, Canada's emissions have actually fallen. And rough overall numbers that they've fallen by about 20% over the last 20 years. And that's been overwhelmingly from the work of the oil and gas sector. The Alberta minister referenced yesterday, and Mark made reference to it as well. I think a 52% reduction, and Patrick will probably talk about that. That's in Alberta. But overall, nationally, it's about 20%. As Matt noted, oil and gas emissions are roughly half of overall emissions. So that's why those numbers don't quite correspond. Now, a large part of the reduction has come from better efforts to control fugitive emissions from gas production. Gas delivery where I work represents a much smaller percentage. And if you could look closely at some of those slides that Matt put up, you could see that. Transmission and distribution is roughly 3% of the overall emission portfolio. So it's a less significant percentage, but nonetheless, it matters, and we care a lot about how we're managing that, and we're trying to reduce the amount of emissions coming from that 3% of the overall mix. And the way we do that, a variety of things we've done in an effort to do it. First, most obviously, it's the constant updating of our infrastructure. So many people talk about methane emissions coming out of urban systems, out of urban distribution systems. One of the biggest causes of that is old pipe, so cast iron pipe in old systems. Well, Canada actually phased out cast iron pipe entirely by 2012. So there's no more cast iron in our distribution system. In addition, we continue to phase out pneumatic devices, looking to ensure that they're replaced with low or no bleed devices to reduce emissions there. And we're constantly working with leak detection and radar technologies. And overall, our efforts have, since the year 2000, resulted in a 72% reduction in methane from the transmission and distribution system across the country. Now, one of the largest causes of methane emissions in the distribution side of the business is actually third-party damages. So that means people digging in their backyards, people doing construction work in cities, and striking systems. And we have affected an over 60% reduction in third-party damage-related emissions since 1995, just by better education, by call before you dig programs, by those kinds of initiatives. So another significant way to reduce emissions on the downstream side. Now, overall, our work here in Baku is focused on financing for this COP, on climate financing. And at CGA, the Gas Association, we made a considerable effort to focus on financing ourselves for new technology. We created something called the Natural Gas Innovation Fund about 6 years ago. First, what we did was we pulled capital from some of the distribution utilities to look at making grants to new technology companies. There was significant interest in that. We started advertising the idea across the country, and we attracted a fair number of startup companies coming to us, many of them in academic institutions like Matt's, with new technology ideas. That quickly grew, and the whole value chain became involved in the initiative. And we've had as many as 15 companies involved in this granting mechanism. So what that means, it's oil and gas companies, it's distribution utilities, pooling resources to make grants to start up technologies for methane. As that granting program evolved, there became more interest in trying to take these companies to the next level. And we created an equity fund. We raised $55 million, all private sector capital, $55 million to make equity investments in these startups to take them to the next level. And then further to that, we created something called an emission testing center, which is based in Alberta on a site owned by Tourmaline, one of Canada's largest, in fact, currently the largest natural gas producer in the country. What we do at the Emission Testing Center is we give an opportunity for startup technology companies to actually apply their technology at a wellhead site and test and see how it works. So with our granting mechanism, with our equity mechanism, with the Emission Testing Center, we continue to work very hard to drive industry leadership in reducing emissions. And I think we've contributed significantly to the success we have. And as we look forward, the opportunity we have is not just to continue to improve the Canadian picture, of which we're very, very proud, but to look at what we can do to take these technologies to the world. Thanks, Mark. But that'll wrap
Well,
up.
thank you. Yeah, awesome comments. It's awesome to see the private sector stepping up and putting all the capital that you indicate to further the technology advancements, following up from Matt's early stage developments. And now we're going to hear from the government side. Patrick, my pleasure to ask Patrick McDonald, Assistant Deputy Minister with Alberta Environment and Protected Area. Patrick.
Perfect. Thanks a lot for that introduction, and again to my fellow panelists here for sharing that. Again, very informative and important and great results there. It's always good to see the downward trend in reductions, and again all the innovation proceeding and going on within Canada to make progress towards this really important issue related to methane. And as I noted, it's been referred to a couple of times here today. It's been a success story in Alberta, and that's one thing I'm really pleased to be able to report on today is, with all the innovation and actions, that has been, again, maybe spurred a little bit through the policy environment, but as well as just through the approach that, Alberta's sector and service industry has been taking. We have achieved a 52% reduction of the 2014 target that was set. And so maybe just before we get into that, a little bit of a history again in Alberta, because this is something that has been a focus for a number of years. With starting with Alberta being the first regional government in North America to set a methane reduction target. That was way back in 2016, and in last year, we did report that we had exceeded that 45% reduction, and that's 3 years ahead of schedule. And what drove that? What really drove that was an enabling policy environment, the commitment of Alberta's oil and gas and natural gas producers and the service industry that supports them, and then as well as the technology ecosystem, which has really been setting up. And there's a number of even again, this panel is a example of the collaboration and the different areas that are contributing to this, through PTAC, through CRIN, and through academia. But so what does that reduction mean just in terms of emissions? And maybe, just to put that in context, 2014, in the recent report that the Alberta Energy Regulator released, there was 32 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. Now that's, around 15 million tons. So, that's a year-over-year reduction now of approximately 17 million tons of CO2 equivalent that would otherwise be there if there wasn't this progress being made. The regulatory framework in Alberta consists of a couple of different directives. There's a Directive 60, which looks at upstream venting, incinerating, flaring, and then there's as well another version of that, another directive named Directive 17, which focuses on measurement, because both of those things kind of go hand in hand. You need to understand what's out there, what's going on in terms of the system, in order, the right actions to be focused on. So that's really that regulatory arm of the requirements. I'd say more than that, another element that's quite unique to Alberta and has enabled kind of this early action, this early adoption, has been a market mechanism. And this market mechanism is enabled through the Technology Innovation and Emission Reduction Program, which is really the large emitter program within Alberta, which has been in place since 2007. One of the largest long-standing industrial levy programs in North America and likely even the world. And so what has enabled that is there's an offset program and elements included in that, so that if there's an opportunity, which there is in methane, and it makes sense, folks can focus on that and can implement projects to get those reductions delivered and be part of a market. And so there's an offset protocol related to pneumatic changeouts, which has been again a key technology in achieving a major part of this reduction. And it did have an amount included in the overall inventory there. But that being said, there is to date 7 million tons of a CO2 equivalent related reduction just from that protocol alone. So you know, Alberta has really tried to create this innovative environment to drive market, to drive investment and innovation in these type of technologies. And really, I think the first piece is to observe is that, you know, it has worked. You know, we've achieved our initial target. We've surpassed that. And all these technologies that have contributed to reducing those existing reductions, you know, are going to be able to be deployed on the new developments, on the new projects, so that what would have once resulted in those emissions that we're currently mitigating is not even going to exist. And not only that, we're reducing the additional. So I'd just say, you know, to close out here in summary, you know, Alberta is keen to take the successes that we've had in this space and to apply them going forward, and to really take stock in, you know, how do we get to that next, you know, that next round, that increased emissions, so that we're not only again driving emission reductions domestically, but how do we share those learnings outside of Alberta, outside of Canada, to the world. Thanks.
Awesome. And thank you, Patrick. Good to hear the mix of regulatory compliance and incentives as a foundation for all this innovation. Next, I want to offer Yvan Champagne, Chief Carbon Officer, Carbon AI. And Yvan is one of those innovators that we speak about. It's been about for probably a couple of decades. Yvan, I'll let you offer your experience and your remarks.
Thank you, Mark. First off, I want to say thank you very much to Corinne for the opportunity to join the panel today. You know, when I think about Alberta and our link to this question around methane, the challenge that is truly methane, which is truly a global challenge, you know, I think Alberta has been able to deliver some innovation and some real results in a few key areas. The first would be measurement, and then the second would be mitigation. So measurement becomes so important, as Matthew's research has shown, and as other groups' research has shown, is that we need to figure out, we need to understand, and we need to characterize the problem. Where are the sources of emissions? Where is the methane coming from? But if all you're doing is measurement for measurement's sake, and you're not actually tackling the problem, you're not actually solving anything. And I think it's that second piece, the mitigation piece, where Alberta has really been world leading. Being able to take the learnings from the great research that's being done to be able to understand and characterize that problem, to be able to move to that mitigation stage, putting in solutions that'll actually start tackling the problem. So Patrick and I were actually on a panel yesterday, and I do want to take 1 second to highlight the importance of this 52% reduction in methane emissions, which I believe is truly world leading. If we look at the challenge that we have in front of us with climate change, methane is in fact the most important priority globally. If every jurisdiction that produces oil and gas or uses oil and gas were to reduce their methane emissions by 52%, we would get back on track in terms of hitting our climate targets. And the most important piece is in that time frame, the fact that Alberta has been able to achieve this in an 8 or 9 year time frame is really world leading. So how did Alberta get there? You know, in a previous role, I had the pleasure of leading a large methane reduction program in Alberta involving 42 different oil and gas producers across the province, specifically on pneumatic device conversions. We, in that program, I believe retrofitted, removed, or replaced over 12,000 pieces of equipment over a period of around 3.5 years. And we were able to do that for a number of reasons. One is the ecosystem that supports Alberta, the fact that we have an actionable price signal in Alberta, which is a real differentiator, and one that rewards innovation. And that last piece is really important, because if we think about methane as a problem, it's not just one source, right? There are certain greenhouse gases globally where you are dealing with a small group of very large point sources, but methane is about leaks and vents, various sizes, various points. And so market-based mechanisms have tended to work exceptionally well to really go drive and find those opportunities for mitigation, the development of technologies that can solve those problems, both big and small. And I think that's really been a key driver. If you look at the companies, again, both on measurement and mitigation, the innovation that's come out of Alberta, it's really been about that. So, you know, out of the experience that we had in Alberta through the pneumatics program, what it allowed us to do is develop and innovate on a model, basically a carbon finance model, where we could use a carbon price signal, an actionable carbon price signal, to go drive reductions. And so we've been able to take that model across the world, in places like Africa and the Middle East, again, on sources mostly on the larger side, so tackling large flare gas conservation projects. But I think what's been at the heart of how we've approached things is kind of an Alberta mindset, which is really about, okay, it's great to understand what that problem is. But again, if you're not moving to the implementation stage and actually getting something done, implementing a project, you haven't solved anything. So, I think if I think about methane technologies and development, how that happens, again, it's that link between figuring out measurement, so understanding what the problem is, and then having a system that it enables mitigation, and on a time frame that is short enough that has really made a difference in Alberta.
Awesome. And I just want to note some of the numbers you mentioned, 12,000 change out. That was pre-COVID, right?
Yes.
So it's not like just now. You've been at it. This industry and this government across Canada has been at it for a long time.
Yes. Yeah. So that period of time would have, I think we started our changeouts in that particular program in 2017, and most of those swap outs, I think, were completed by 2020.
And we're no longer talking about this part, right?
No, I think that
this is done.
particular problem has been solved. But this is I think this is really the characterization of the methane challenge, is that you can solve one thing, but once you solve that one thing, then you can move on to the next order of priorities. I think that's why the research is so important, because the research continuously develops and gives us better insights into where those emissions are coming from. But then the next step is, how do you find the next solution to solve that next problem? We're really excited at Carbon AI. One of the areas that we are now looking at is surface casing vent flows, which again is an ubiquitous source of emissions. It's not just a Canadian problem; it's a global problem. And so we've been looking at an innovative solution to be able to tackle that, using a lot of the learnings that we had on pneumatics.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you for your attention. My name is Alan Fogwell. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for the Petroleum Technology Alliance Canada. We are a nonprofit organization dedicated to reducing the environmental impact of the oil and gas sector. I'm here today to mention all the aspects we are dealing with in terms of the future of methane emissions reduction capacity in partnership with the industry and other stakeholders. PTAC's grand vision deals with both detection and mitigation. In terms of mitigation, our target is to reduce methane emissions on oil and gas upstream sites by 75% by 2030. In order to do that, we need to determine where the emissions are coming from. So we need better, more cost-effective technologies to find out where the emissions are coming from at the equipment level, because it's at that level that we need to develop the technology solutions. We have a good track record to date. We can demonstrate that we've helped the development of new technologies to reduce emissions by 48%. And we intend to go even further based on our grand vision. PTAC gets help in its innovation ecosystem through the volunteer aspects of industry experts, members, and in terms of the methane emissions, our strategic partner, the Clean Resource Innovation Network, funded by our federal government. In addition to that funding, we are also getting funded by over 450 oil and gas producers focused on trying to reduce their methane emissions as well as other environmental impacts. Part of those projects deal with field trials in order to fully appreciate how these technologies operate in harsh conditions. We have achieved up to 48% capacity, but we need to do more. And in 4 areas, we are focused on developing those additional solutions. All these areas relate to improving the combustion efficiency of these technologies in terms of catalytic heaters from 50 to 70% up towards 90%. For flaring, using auto igniters to get up to a 98% level, venting from storage tanks to remove all that venting through vapor recovery units and use it for other means. And in terms of stationary engines, moving from 4 to 5 grams per kilowatt hour down to around 1 gram per kilowatt hour. Our work is not done, and we need all the collaboration we could possibly get. So if you're interested in joining us or learning more, you can contact my colleague who's at the conference, Mark Godin, or you can contact me via email.
So yeah, so about let's talk very briefly here about the complexity. I'll turn it back to Matt here, because you said you had a lot of acronyms, a lot of numbers, a lot of pie charts. Give us a sense here for those people in the audience or listening online, how complicated this is. And Ivan alluded to it a bit. It's thousands of small sources all over the landscape.
Yeah, it's really hard to convey for those who don't know or haven't been out in the field. And, yes, I mean, I'm an academic. I've spent a fair bit of time in the field for an academic, but that's still nothing like.
And your students, right? You got students driving trucks.
Absolutely. But every time you go out, you learn something new. In Canada, we've got 190,000 active wells as a ballpark across all provinces, about 40,000 active facilities, depending on what you count. And each of those, will have, depending on the facility, there's tanks, there's separators, there's lots of pneumatic equipment, busters, flares, all these individual things have their own unique aspects, unique potential to emit, unique challenges to mitigate. And then you scale that up globally. It's just an unbelievable challenge to just get enough human capital, insight, drive, financing to address this. And the fact that we've had so much success to date is actually quite exciting in that context. Not to take anything away from the challenge that remains. There's a lot more to do. But it is, important to acknowledge.
If I could ask you to elaborate just at a very high level here without getting technical, a lot of numbers get thrown out, 52% or 48% and 45%, and depending on provinces, depending on baselines. Why is this so complicated? Why isn't a simple number out there? And just provide us some guidance.
Oh, thanks. That's a really important question.
It's not that we don't know what we're doing, right?
No. Historically, emissions in inventories around the world have been estimated. And as an estimate, they're not particularly reliable. And so if you want to track estimates year over year, it'll give you some insight, but it's different than directly measuring. And so, it's a bottom up, what's called a bottom up, which means you estimate every one of those pneumatics, multiply by the number of pneumatics, every tank, and you generate a number that comes with a lot of uncertainty. If you actually measure, you get a different answer. And so different numbers that get quoted really have to be taken in the context of how they're generated.
And now we have top-down measurements from satellites and airplanes, and you got to reconcile all that.
Yeah, and so what's really changed in the past couple of years is the ability to measure at scale. And so pretty much every jurisdiction that's done these measurements at scale have found different answers when they measure from the tops, as it were, in what was previously been calculated. But what we're trying to show here is that once you commit to that measurement, and you mentioned the pie charts, you see the pie charts for where the methane is actually coming from, that changes your view of what you want to do next. And, it points to the importance of pneumatics and the surface casing vent flow. I'd love to hear more what you've got planned there. These really important sources that maybe weren't necessarily on the radar. We spent a lot of time chasing fugitive emissions around the world, different kind of academic studies that said it's just all about leaks. I can tell you in our personal experience, it's really all about the venting and the tanks and these other sources. And once you have that understanding and act on it, then you start to see the mitigation.
And the track record, as Eva indicated, we find a source, we have a plan of action, and we get it done, right? And then you're moving to the next source. And Matt, you were talking about surface casing vent flow, which I don't want to describe this here, but it's technical, a specific source. Matt's talking about tanks, and there's also compressors. So Patrick, as we go, we've achieved a lot, but are we going to achieve more? And what are the new targets that you see coming?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And again, yeah, we've achieved lots. Completely agree, but you know, we're not you know gonna stop there, and the industry's not. You know, they're continuing to implement these new technologies, as I noted earlier, on the new developments, but as well on the existing sites. You know, looking at how do we understand and how do we do things better. And I think that's one of the key pieces. We're kind of at a really pivotal moment because again, in light of the progress and success we've had, there's an understanding that you know there is more to do, but it is fundamentally important to really take stock in terms of the learnings, like what mechanisms, what policy mechanisms, what enabled this this path that we were on, and what sources, what are the primary new opportunities to gain process. So you know we've been contributing a great deal to other programs to support and understand you know how do we use these monitoring technologies in conjunction with each other to really ensure that we're focusing resources in the right space, because regardless in no matter what you're doing, there is going to be limited resources, and so we want to ensure that those are being put towards efforts that are going to have the largest impact and contribute to again essentially get the biggest result that we're looking for. So yeah, we're kind of and
So it's watch this space for new things.
yeah, you bet.
Perfect. And Tim, all this progress, what about natural gas as a fuel for the future, right? So where do you see that going? We've addressed the leaks, addressed a lot of what Yvonne spoke about, and there's more progress that will be made. What's the opportunity for natural gas in other countries?
Well, as I said off the start, it's the fastest growing energy source in Canada. It's the fastest growing energy source in the world. I think you saw on Matt's chart, or rather on the chart that you put up, Mark.
Yep.
The global reality.
Yeah, it replaces coal globally.
It's replacing coal, but also as you think about new technologies for electric generation that people are very keen on, like wind and solar, they require backup. You know, the go-to backup is natural gas for a host of technologies. As you look at electrical generation demand growth because of AI, because of just standard growth, because of economic growth around the world,
or electric cars.
You need power. You need something to generate that power,
Yes,
right?
right.
And the go-to source is invariably natural gas. So applying that to our conversation about methane, and what we're doing on methane management in Canada, as we look at the opportunity not just to meet Canadian energy needs with natural gas, but global needs with Canadian natural gas, we should also be thinking about what are we doing to take our methane management technologies to the world. Because if we are, look, as everybody's noted, there are always things we can do to improve. But if we've gotten very good at doing this, we should be thinking about how we take this to the world. So, you know, if I had a message for governments, provincial and federal, I'd say, can we talk more about the opportunity to take some of our technologies to the world? Because if global emission reductions is the objective and we're very good at it and we want to get our fuel to the world, help us take our methane mitigation, our methane management technologies to the world too. So we're delivering an environmental benefit and an economic.
So like what Yvonne just said, if other jurisdiction did this 52%, let's teach them to do it, right? Is that what you're?
Yeah. Let's realize that as an opportunity for Canada.
Yes, and the opportunity is the sales of technology, products, services, right? So from Canadian entrepreneurs and innovators.
Yeah, all while we're delivering affordable and reliable energy to Canadians and citizens around the
And
world.
where do you see LNG in here? I was wondering if you were going to speak about LNG.
Well, look, the opportunity for Canadian LNG exports is an enormous one. It hasn't developed nearly as quickly as we would have liked it to have, but it is, you know, we're seeing some really exciting projects get off the ground now. We're looking at the LNG Canada project, having its first exports very shortly, several other projects on the West Coast. When you think about natural gas globally, the single biggest opportunity is to move LNG around the world. And we've got conversations underway in the Canadian gas industry with prospective buyers in markets from right around the world. And at a time of, concern about energy security, LNG is increasingly the fuel of choice.
Absolutely.
And people want Canadian LNG. So
Yes.
it's a real opportunity that we think Canada should be pursuing as aggressively as we can.
Awesome. And going back to you, Ivan, and so we're taking these technologies to the world, and that's what you're doing, right? And walk us through the mix of your experience in going to Africa and other parts of the world, bringing this learning and commercializing it over there.
I want to maybe, if I can pick up just before I dive into that on one thing that Tim just said is, absolutely the opportunity for LNG is massive across the world. But it's really interesting to see what's happening in a number of really important jurisdictions globally. So if you look at what is happening in Europe with their new methane regulation, the methane intensity regulation, where in a 5-year period, if you are planning to import natural gas into Europe, you will have to meet a methane intensity standard. Japan is taking a very similar approach, trying to look at the gas and the energy that is coming into their country and understanding what the methane intensity is of those molecules. And this becomes really, really important. So if I think from a competitive standpoint for Canada, which country is going to be best positioned to really understand the methane intensity of its natural gas that's being exported? Canada is really in a preferential position from that perspective. Does it mean that we solved the problem? That we don't have work to do? No. In fact, there's a lot of work to do. But I want to put it into, I'll use one example. So I mentioned earlier that we've been involved in working on large flare gas commercialization projects. And in those cases, what we're trying to do typically is take associated gas that is produced in conjunction with oil production and try to find a way to conserve those molecules in some way or another. And, when we talk about flare gas, people in the methane community say, well, this is a flaring project. This isn't actually a methane project. And we have to clarify for them that in a place like Canada, where we have really strict regulations on burner efficiency, on flare efficiency, yeah, you might be right. But in most of the world, and this is a really important point, in most of the world, if you are dealing with flares that are 30, 40 years old, I can tell you right now, when you look at these flares, when you hear these flares, you know that the combustion efficiency is not at 99%.
So GHG Sat will see them from the sky.
Yes, and so you talk about top down, bottom up.
Yeah.
This is someone asked me yesterday in a different discussion, what was the importance of satellite monitoring? The importance of satellite monitoring is that people who haven't necessarily had transparent reporting can't cheat anymore, right? The idea is that if you have an unlit flare, a cold flare somewhere in the world, like Turkmenistan, I think GHG Sat has talked about that example a lot. You can't hide that anymore because you've got satellites that are going to pick that up. I think competitively, again, for Canada, that's really, really important because I think we are doing the right thing. We're reporting, we're catching that data. And we're going to be able to tell that story in an auditable fashion. So the data quality that we have that supports our claims is going to be, I believe, world leading. But if I step back and look at, the differences in Canada and, in a place like Nigeria is a great example. I think of the scrutiny that the Canadian oil and gas sector is under on a daily basis from various NGO groups about performance. And when you see what is happening in countries that don't have regulatory frameworks like we have, that don't have access to capital, they don't have an actionable carbon price signal, it's night and day. And, it's not to say that we don't have work to do in Canada, but we are doing some fantastic things. But, I think about what's next. LNG, I think, is going to be an excellent example to really showcase, I think, what is going to be some of the lowest greenhouse gas and lowest methane intensity natural gas in the world. But we have to keep innovating. It's not just about, okay, we've done the work. We've got it. We can look at other stuff now. There is significant work still left to do. I don't want to underestimate that problem. But the great news is that we have a framework. We have in Alberta a market-based price signal that is actionable. That if a company develops a new technology that is tackling one specific item, that they have within a short period of time the ability to monetize those emission reductions. And if I can use an example of kind of this trajectory of development that I've seen, if I can use tourmaline oil as an example, in our methane program on pneumatics that I mentioned earlier, tourmaline was, I believe, the largest participant in that program. And I believe that was one of their first forays in emission reductions projects. But what has tourmaline done since then? Tourmaline is, I believe, one of the biggest funders of the Natural Gas Innovation Fund, a contributor there. They've set up their own testing center where you can test new technologies at one of their facilities. They have embarked on countless different programs across their operations to find, again, what is that next source? What is that next challenge they can tackle? And I think that's the beauty, I think, of what I've seen in Canada is people get started on the journey and then they keep going. It's not like a one and done or they stop. Is that those companies, once they start understanding the opportunities they have, they start chipping away at it. And that's really, I think, the story globally that we need to see more countries embark on, which is, methane is not this massive problem that you can't solve. How you solve it is piece by piece. You get started. You start with this, you start with the easy work, and then you work your way up the problem.
And part I want to draw out in the last few minutes here is the celebration of these accomplishments is kind of a feel-good thing, but as everybody's kind of drawn out, it's we need to monetize these existing accomplishment to fund the next level of innovation, right? So,
Yeah.
and Matt.
Yeah, and I just, just to pick up one quick thing on that is, what drove a lot of that early action and enabled that is one thing I would say is flexibility and working together, right? So, if policy or regulations are overly prescriptive and you need to do this a certain way, it doesn't enable folks to really get that benefit. So a flexible approach has been one piece that has been pursued in Alberta and has helped deliver that result. And now, we are at a place that we've effectively kind of decoupled.
Can I ask you just to speak a bit about flexibility very quickly? It's not that it's loose. It's a structured mechanism of consultation, and it preserves the integrity of the regulations.
I think it preserves the integrity of the regulations for sure. I'd say, just in terms of, but enabling the fact that if you can do things a certain way, but if it makes sense, there's mechanisms in place to enable that so that, you're not putting resources in something that might necessarily have the best, the best reduction. Because we have a variety of different production types. We have natural gas wells, we have heavy oil wells, wells. So I think we can appreciate that, different tools and different approaches.
There's piloting of regulations, right? So testing out this mechanism and see how it goes. Okay, Matt.
But I think the key point, and I was really glad to hear it raised, is there is an absolute target we need to get to, at least globally. If you talk about LNG exports, it's that intensity target. Right now, that's 0.2%. That will get lower in time. And so.
And it's set by big markets.
Big markets, international markets, it's kind of almost universal alignment, through OGMP 2.0, on Gas Climate Initiative, all these at that current target of about 3.2%. And then there's
so differentiated gas will be a reality, you think?
Yeah, and
commercial reality.
And I think importantly, it's good to celebrate, whatever percentage reductions we've achieved. But as you said, it is a bit of the feel good story. What really matters is the work isn't done yet. We need to get to that 0.2% and then below that. Some places in Canada are pretty much there now, as I just showed, which is quite exciting. And very exciting for LNG, if it's going to serve as value potential, but we have more work to do.
Any final comments from anyone here? We got 30 seconds left.
I will say one thing. You brought up the question of how has Alberta been able to drive some of these reductions? And if I look at Alberta and I compare to different places across the world, is that Alberta has been able to embrace a carrot and stick approach, right? So a stick is typically seen as regulation. So, you implement or you continuously iterate on your regulations to get more and more stringency. But I think what's been magic in Alberta is the combination of regulations that are consistently getting stricter, but an incentive, the carrot, if you will, through early action periods and really providing that carrot to producers or companies to say, if you actually implement a technology or put in place equipment early, that you're going to be able to monetize those reductions. And that particular piece, if you look at, I think one of the reasons why Alberta has been able to hit its target early, it is because of those incentives, that positive price signal that drives companies such as ourselves or producers to go chase that action. But people tend in certain conversations in the policy world, people tend to see that as maybe a negative. But I think nothing could be further from the truth, because again, thinking about methane, every molecule, every ton matters. And when you pull action forward, meaning you are creating emission reductions today instead of next year or the year after that, that the time value of that carbon, or methane in this case, is absolutely massive. And that's what we should all be doing. That, I think, is the story. It's not about setting a regulation that takes effect 5 years from now. It's how do you drive action today? How do you get people to pull forward those emission reductions? Again, that's, I think, a really important part of the Alberta story.
Perfect.
Mark,
Yep.
if I had a final comment, just
Absolutely. Go ahead.
just talking about targets, and I just make the point that yes, always more to do when targets have been set and we haven't achieved them, but targets don't exist in a vacuum. Targets exist in the context of markets, and those markets are about delivering, in our case, delivering energy, right? And people want their energy to be affordable and reliable, as well as to meet a variety of environmental commitments. So we need to ensure that we're constantly maintaining a balanced perspective on what's going on.
All right. Thank you, panelists. Awesome conversation. I'm glad that you made the time to join us today. Thank you, people on the audience, for joining us today. Bye for now.